Hi, everyone, and welcome to yet another installment of our lecture series. This is going to be our second to last lecture, and today we're going to be covering the wisdom literature, the three books in the Bible that are wisdom books. Before we jump into those actual books in particular, however, I want to kind of start by talking about some of the backgrounds of wisdom literature and where we see it coming from throughout the ancient Near East. Wisdom literature is particularly interesting because we have a lot of examples of it throughout the ancient Near East, and a lot of these examples are very, very old. We have works of wisdom that deal or that go back, some 4,500 years, particularly from ancient Egypt, but also throughout Mesopotamia. Egypt, though, is really kind of the center of the wisdom tradition when we think about the ancient Near East. And it was one of the more common types of literature produced there. It was oftentimes used to train scribes, and we have numerous examples of wisdom literature that survive from ancient Egypt. A lot of these works are attributed to rulers, but within the text themselves, what we really see at work more often than not are a kind of middle class, to use an anachronistic phrase to be sure, but bear with me on that, some sort of what we would call middle class values or a middle class feel to them, in that they focus on the behavior of bureaucrats or court officials, folks that are in the not themselves necessarily in the royal family, but also certainly not of the laborers. So they kind of fall somewhere in the middle. So a sort of ancient middle class, although again that's an anachronistic term. And what these texts do oftentimes is they serve to give values or certain ways of living that will lead to a successful or fruitful or otherwise good life. So we see these kind of texts all throughout the ancient Near East, but we also see them in the Bible, though it should be said their position in the Old Testament and the way they fit in with with the rest of the Old Testament has been something of a contentious matter, particularly over the last 100 years or so. To understand this, or what I mean by that, we have to look a little bit more at the subdiscipline of Old Testament studies called Old Testament theology. Now, for most of the 20th century, this subdiscipline of Old Testament theology regarded wisdom literature as something of a problem. And the reason for this is because what most Old Testament theologians were seeking to do was to find what was called the mitta, or the center of the Old Testament, the theological concept or heart of the Old Testament, around which all the other ideas revolved, and the thing that really brought coherence to the canon. There are a lot of proposals for what this center should be, proposals like covenant or revelation or righteousness, but most of them really tended to kind of find that center in the Pentateuch and to a lesser extent the prophets, but nearly always this center would essentially fail when it came to the wisdom literature, which is to say that whatever that theme was that the theologian was offering, it was a theme that was not a central theme for wisdom literature. A consequence of this, then, a consequence of not finding that center in wisdom literature, was that wisdom literature was relatively ignored and sidelined by scholars that were looking for these things. That is, until a major turning point. And this really big turning point was Gerhard von Rath's third volume in his Old Testament theology, and this was his volume about wisdom literature. So what von Rott did here is he acknowledged some of the things that makes wisdom literature different and unique, but von Rott argued that it was nevertheless an integral part of Yahwistic religion. That is, that wisdom literature is not something that stood apart from the rest of the canon, but in fact was part of the same religious tradition. And since von Rott's work that really reframed wisdom literature and its relationship to the rest of the canon, there really has been an explosion of scholarship on the subject of wisdom literature. And right now, it really is one of the most active areas of inquiry in biblical studies. So in the last 50 years or so, we've really seen a whole lot of really interesting and really groundbreaking work when it comes to wisdom literature. When we talk about wisdom literature itself, though, we need to talk about some of the assumptions that underlie it. Primary among the reasons that wisdom literature was sidelined for so long, really, is because it operates with a different set of assumptions than does other parts of the canon. So most prominent, one of the easier ways that we can see this is that wisdom literature relies on observation rather than on revelation. Now, let me unpack what I mean by that. And to be clear, when I say that, I don't mean that wisdom literature precludes revelation or denies it necessarily, particularly if we want to call Torah revelation, and there would be good reason to do so. But what I mean is that within wisdom literature, revelation is not sought, nor is it typically given. That is, the sages, the folks who are writing wisdom literature, are not waiting for that aha moment or for a prophetic oracle, for that what we might call the kind of moment of acute inspiration. Rather, wisdom literature operates using observations, things like analogies to nature, or social mores that lead to betterment, or what we really might just simply call common sense. We see in wisdom literature a tendency not towards the extraordinary, the miracles or wondrous events, or those kind of groundbreaking, historically significant moments, but rather we see an emphasis on the ordinary. Wisdom literature is most at home in the family or on the job, in the situations that one might expect to encounter on a day-to-day basis. And as such, its concern is often on the mundane, even if there's a certain amount of wonder to be found there. So that's not to say that there isn't wonder in wisdom literature, or there isn't a place for the extraordinary. It's just that that's not the primary concern there. So when we speak of wisdom literature in the Bible, and the Hebrew Bible, we're really talking about three books: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Job. And we're going to discuss all three of those individually in just a bit. The Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon, or the Canticle, is however we want to call it, is occasionally listed among the wisdom books, but really this belongs to the genre of ancient love poetry, and so we're not going to deal with it today. We should also note that there are some deuterocanonical books that are very clearly wisdom books, notably Ben Sirach, sometimes also called Sirach or Ecclesiasticus, and also the Wisdom of Solomon. These are certainly wisdom books. Again, because they're not a part of the Protestant canon, we're not going to deal with those, but you should note that those are there, and they are in your Bibles, and I would highly encourage you to read through them. And beyond the books that are properly wisdom literature themselves, there are also books that exhibit, or there are also texts that exhibit wisdom features, notably sapiential or wisdom psalms like Psalm 1 or Psalm 73, arguably Psalm 119, as well as other places that have narratives that have a lot of wisdom themes, notably the Joseph story in Genesis 37 through 50. Again, clearly not itself a wisdom text, but there are lots of elements of wisdom literature that show up in that particular narrative. So we're going to turn to the book of Proverbs and talk about that first. Proverbs is the clearest example and the most sustained example in the Bible of what we might call the practical or traditional the wisdom literature, a specific type of wisdom literature that we call practical or traditional. Within the book of Proverbs itself, furthermore, we can discern several sections. So we have a section in chapters 1 to 9, a sustained unit here that takes the form of instruction from a parent to a child. So we're going to talk about that for a little bit. The basic element in this section is the idea or the instruction about the fear of the Lord. Now, this is a very complex and loaded phrase, and it can refer to a few different things. It can refer kind of broadly speaking to any particular religious duty, or it could refer much more narrowly to the particular obligations laid forth in the Torah. And it's this latter usage to which it kind of moves, arguably in Proverbs 1 to 9, and certainly by the time that we see this phrase in Ben Sira, it has exactly that usage in mind. Within Proverbs, this term occurs 10 times, 4 of which are located in this unit of chapters 1 to 9, which really marks it as the kind of fundamental element of the theology of Proverbs. Also included in this section is a lengthy and very famous speech of personified wisdom in chapter 8, who is presented here as having existed as the kind of first fruits of creation that was around when God created the world. Yet wisdom is not something that is distant or unobtainable in Proverbs. Instead, wisdom makes herself available. She calls out, just as does the personified folly, seeking to be chosen here. So what we have in this section of Proverbs really is a sharp contrast and established terms of choice that face every person. And so the choice then, clearly the good choice, right, is to choose wisdom and not to choose to go after folly. When we get to chapter 10 in Proverbs, we note that the book takes on a rather kind of sudden shift, and that the Proverbs become decidedly more pithy, right? So instead of sustained reflections or sustained speeches like we get in Proverbs 8, what we get are just individual little kind of chunks of wisdom, right? One verse is kind of a unit into itself. Now, these are organized into larger collections, and collections that are often attributed to particular figures like Solomon. But the Proverbs themselves really just occupy a single verse, or maybe in the case of a long one, 2 verses. There are oftentimes kind of small connections that tie them together, or that really aid flow from one to the other, but really they're just units into themselves. You can kind of think of these as things that might fit onto a fortune cookie, right? There's no larger context to be discerned oftentimes. But while their contents really do vary quite a bit, and they discuss a wide range of issues, there are a few tendencies that we can observe. First, the overriding concern, the really undergirding concern, we might even say, is that of doing right and working hard, and the equation of those things with success and prosperity. So we can see this right off the bat in chapter 10, in verses 2 to 4, right? The kind of some of the first proverbs that we get in this section. Here they are, right? Beginning in verse 2. Treasures gained by the wicked do not profit, but righteousness delivers from death. One proverb. Second one. The Lord does not let the righteous go hungry, but he thwarts the craving of the wicked. Third proverb. A slack hand causes poverty, but the hand of the diligent makes rich. Okay, so what we see in each of these proverbs is this idea that positive behavior leads to life and to prosperity. And that is in opposition with negative behavior, which leads to ruin and death. So this is a really, really, really big theme in Proverbs. And most of the Proverbs have some sort of variation on that particular theme. Also within this section, we notice that there are substantial interactions in Proverbs with the Proverbs and the traditions of other ancient Near Eastern cultures. And we can see this most especially in Proverbs 22:17 to 24:34, which really has a lot of very, very strong similarities with an Egyptian text called the Instruction of Amenemope. Now, we need not really be surprised and certainly not threatened by this, because what we notice in wisdom is something of a universal character, something that works in the realm of manners and common sense, right, as we've already noted. And we've noted as well that Egypt is kind of the center of wisdom, of the wisdom tradition in the ancient Near Eastern world, but that we see this tradition throughout the ancient Near East. So it's not really surprising that a lot of these themes that are so universal would have worked their way into the Israelite tradition, and that seems to be what we have in those chapters in Proverbs, a reworking. To be sure, it's not an exact copy, right? It's more about thematic overlap and seeing a lot of similarity. But we shouldn't be surprised that we see a lot of these themes that are so prominent in Egyptian texts showing up in the Israelite text as well. Moving on, our second book that we are going to discuss in the wisdom tradition is the book of Ecclesiastes. So if the hallmark of the book of Proverbs is this what we might call optimistic view about the relationship between hard work and prosperity, doing good, all of these things, Ecclesiastes flips that equation somewhat on its head. Ecclesiastes belongs to a tradition that is generally called the skeptical wisdom tradition. So like the practical or traditional wisdom, the things like the book of Proverbs, skeptical wisdom shares the assumption that observation is the primary method of gaining knowledge. But where it differs is in its conclusion, as skeptical wisdom texts do not see a kind of clear correspondence between good living and prosperity. When we look at how Ecclesiastes is presented, we see, first of all, right there in chapter 1, right, that the author identifies himself as Kohelet in Hebrew. Kohelet comes from a root that has to do with the idea of assembling or perhaps teaching in this case. But we notice that the teachings here really are far removed from those of Proverbs. Rather, the author, who describes his own life experiences in the opening chapters, describes himself as having gone throughout life looking for all the experiences that life has to offer, but in the end finds himself really quite disillusioned with the whole enterprise. What he finds is that the wicked often prosper and the righteous often suffer, and that no matter how you live your life, you die, and you, in the end, that everybody dies, right? The good, the bad, everyone. And so for Kohelet, this is all summed up in what is really the most important word in this whole book, and that is the word hevel. Now, hevel has been translated following the tradition of the King James Bible into English as vanity, but we might better translate it in our own time as something like nonsense or something fleeting or even emptiness. Hevel is anything that is impermanent or that does not last. And so for Kohelet, everything is hevel. And because of that, there's no great meaning or overarching purpose to life. There is toil, but that is really it. But before we run off and say that, Kohelet is really just something that sounds like the depressing musings of a disaffected teenager or something like that, we might note that while everything is hevel for Kohelet, that does not mean that life is without value. In all of his wanderings, seeking glory and riches and pleasures, Kohelet is unable to find the thing that will ultimately and for all time satisfy his burning desire. But, and this is the key, there is a kind of satisfaction to be found in the mundane. Now, and that really is the point. While toil may be burdensome if it is done only to achieve a great end, if it's done, if on the other hand toil is done for itself, it really can be the source of enjoyment. So let's consider Ecclesiastes 2:24. It reads, "There is nothing better for mortals than to eat and drink and find enjoyment in their toil. This also I saw is from the hand of God." Now again, in chapter 5, verse 18, we find, "This is what I have seen to be good. It is fitting to eat and drink and find enjoyment in the toil with which we toil under the sun, for the few days of life God gives us. This is our lot." Again in 9:7. Go, eat your bread and drink your wine, for God has long ago approved what you do. So, now, lest we think that the author is advocating a kind of Israelite hedonism, we should not see that this is some sort of ultimate satisfaction here, or nor is it an attempt to satisfy every little desire, or particularly desires of the flesh. What the author instead is doing is seeing that those approaches, and he talks about these approaches early on, right? The trying to satisfy every desire is something that actually that leaves him rather empty. Instead, what Kohelet is after in these verses is finding in the tasks and relationships of everyday life a promise for simple pleasure, even if that itself is somewhat fleeting. But there is pleasure there nonetheless, and that counts for something. Those pleasures don't have to be permanent or ultimate. They are nonetheless real, and that really seems to be the point of comfort for Kohelet. Finally, we're going to turn to the book of Job. Now, Job is something of an anomaly in the Bible, in that it addresses some of the most, well, really one of the most problematic and complex issues that particularly monotheistic religions face in the suffering of a righteous person. That is the question, why do bad things happen to good people, right? Now, it does so through a series of poetic dialogues, but these dialogues are themselves surrounded by some short narrative sections. To sum up the plot, I hope you have read through it recently. If you have not, I would encourage you to go back and reread it. The basic plot of Job is that Job loses everything following a bet that God makes with the Satan. We're going to talk more about who that is on our Saturday session. And following all of these devastating losses, Job and his friends debate the reason for his sufferings until their dialogue becomes ultimately so destructive that they no longer speak to each other. Then, out of nowhere, comes a response from Elihu, and finally, 2 speeches by God. This leads to Job recanting, maybe, what he has said, and ultimately the restoration back in the narrative section of Job and his property, and even an increase in Job's prosperity. So in the end, therefore, one might simply conclude that God is God, and Job needs to shut up and accept all of the things that happen, just because God is God. This is the way Job is oftentimes summed up. Except, and here's the kicker, the closer that one looks at the book of Job, the more complicated it gets, and the less satisfying that reading really is. Job's restoration, for example, particularly his new restoration, is in some ways very hollow, right? After all, his children that died in the beginning of the book are still dead. His repentance also is quite problematic to translate, as is discussed in the Brueggemann and Linnefeld reading that you have for this week. And it could mean that Job accepts fully what God has said, or it could mean that Job has simply reoriented his lot, and now finds a kind of new comfort or new perspective in his new position, but that he's not necessarily recanting what he has said. The speeches, too, are difficult. Job and his friends debate constantly, but it's his friends that really present the more, what we might call, orthodox view, a view that would likely be more at home in the book of Deuteronomy. Yet it is the words of the friends that are condemned by God in the end. Job, on the other hand, who not only risks blasphemy, but seems to kind of charge right over that line on numerous occasions, is proclaimed to have spoken correctly. So in the end, what one is left with is some puzzling questions of what has just happened and what has been accomplished. The answer to that question may simply be that what has been accomplished is the dialogue itself. That is, the dialogue between Job, the friends, and ultimately even God represents a genuine encounter with the other, a deep interaction of people seeking truth through engagement. They may not find what is an ultimately, they may not find an ultimate and and satisfactory, at least in a final sense, a satisfactory answer, but there is truth and wisdom to be found in their encounters with one another. So if you're interested on this topic, and there is a lot more to be said, certainly, about the book of Job, I would recommend to you reading a book by Carol Newsom called The Book of Job, A Contest of Moral Imaginations. What Newsom really does in this book is explores Job in all of its really very rich complexity, finding within it not so much a clear answer or a moral, but an invitation for the reader to participate in an ongoing and really perpetual conversation created by the book. I will post a link to that in the email and in the discussion group. Now, as always, there is far more that we could say about all three of these books, or even just about wisdom in general. But since we're short of time here, I will have to instead recommend two other books to you if you're interested in exploring these topics a little bit further. Both of these are introductory books that seek to examine the wisdom tradition as a whole, and so they're really an excellent place to start if you would like to kind of delve a little bit further, push into the wisdom tradition a bit more. The first of those books is a book by one of my teachers, Kathleen O'Connor, simply called The Wisdom Tradition. And this is a really beautifully written and very simple introduction that is meant for a popular audience. It's a great place to go, particularly for a theological take on the wisdom tradition and how it fits into the broader Christian tradition. And the second introduction is an introductory book by James Crenshaw entitled Old Testament Wisdom and Introduction. And this also is a really good introduction, a little bit more thorough in its engagement of contemporary scholarship than O'Connor's introductory book. It also has a very, very good and extensive bibliography, should you find yourself wanting to delve even further into this topic. That's all for this week. Remember that we will be doing our exegesis of Job 1 and 2 this Saturday. If you have any questions about that in the meantime, please do get in touch with me. I'll be sending out the sign-up sheet as well for a little bit later today so that we can all have our particular tasks for this weekend. See you Saturday.